the sunshine and the grass is growing, Lord, and all the blessings that comes from that. I thank you for those that are gathered here today. I ask that you bless us today, and I ask you also to bless those that couldn't be here today for whatever reason, Lord. I just pray that you reach out and touch them, touch their hearts today, Lord. And as we go into this message, just give me the words that you want spoken, Lord. I pray that you not only give me the words, but that you also open our hearts and our ears, Lord, to hear the things that you want said. I ask these things in your name and for your glory. Amen.
Amen.
Active listening. Listening with the intention of hearing. That's a strange thing. Most of the time, active listening looks more like this. Pete? Two guys on a deserted island. Are you talking to me? We make jokes of active listening all the time. There's commercials about it. I remember the one that's always played during football season. You got the guy sitting at home and his wife's yelling in his ear and he's just staring at the television. And then they flash to the next scene and he's a referee for the NFL, so he's standing there and people are screaming at him and he's just ignoring him. Active listening is something that we need, though, if we want to build a relationship. And we talk about our relationship with Christ and how it's necessary for our salvation to have a relationship. But whether it's in a individual relationship with a spouse or a loved one, in families, in business, doesn't matter where you are, if you want to have success in that relationship, you have to be able to communicate, and to communicate you have to be able to listen. A lot of us are good at talking, we're not quite so good at listening. So we're going to talk about that relationship and the way Jesus talked about it here in Luke 8. So we need to keep an eye on the fact that the communication is the importance here. In Luke 8, 5-8, it's a parable of the sower. Jesus says, a farmer went out to sow his seed. As he was gathering the seed, some fell along the path, it was trampled on, and the birds ate it up. Some fell on rocky ground, and when it came up, the plants withered because they had no moisture. Other seed fell among the thorns, which grew up with it and choked the plants. Still other seed fell on good soil. It came up and yielded a crop 100 times more than was sown. When he said this, he called out, whoever has ears to hear, let them hear. Whoever has ears to hear. That's an interesting one. Whoever has ears to hear is something that we see Jesus saying often when he goes through his parables. And having ears and hearing are not necessarily the same thing. Everybody who was standing around had ears, but were they actually listening? And that's one of the reasons Jesus taught in parables. He said that things would be revealed to the foolish, but kept from the wise. He spoke in parables because those messages, those lessons that were there, took thought and took faith to understand some of them. But this particular parable he explained. He explained this to the disciples down the line. That's what I'm going to talk about a little bit. He talked about this with the disciples. But even when he talked about it in verses 11 through 18, he talks about this. But at the end of that, he again says, Pete, therefore consider carefully how you listen. Whoever has will be given more. Who does not have, even what they think they have, will be taken from them. Be careful how you listen. Consider it carefully. What he's talking about here, in my opinion, whoever has will be given more, and whoever does not have. There are people there that think they have a grasp on things, but they're not listening to God. They think it's in their own mind. The Pharisees were like that. They blocked off the message from Jesus because they didn't want to hear it. They were standing there listening to him, and they didn't want to hear it. He confronted them specifically, and they did not want to hear it enough to surrender to God and say, you're right, I'm wrong. There was nothing there. There's something about that active listening that becomes very important. We have to take the time to consider our listening. It's not an automatic state of mind that we get into. And we're going to talk about that a little bit. Yesterday, I had an opportunity, a lady in town here asked me to come and trim her horse. And the horse was quite a ways out, not where she lives, quite a ways out. And I've known her for a little while here, and she's a real sweetheart. But this horse had never been trimmed that she knows of. she kept giving me these warnings. He's, you know, not really easy to handle, and she talked about him and was kind of apologizing the whole time, and I thought, you know what, this is one of my charity cases. Because I'm not going to make hardly any money driving as far as I had to drive. It was about 25, 30 miles to get to where it was, and I'm going to spend a lot of time on this horse, and it's not going to be a big deal. But I went up there, and the first thing I did, because she kept talking to me and calling me and talking to me about it, is I want to spend some time working on the horse. Not just the feet, but on the horse. I love doing that kind of stuff anyway. And when I explained to her, because I walked in and right away he relaxed when I came in, and he's not relaxed around her. He throws his head up and he snorts and he does all sorts of stuff. And he's a big, great big gelding. She had another horse with him who died in January. And the horse that was with him was her soulmate. And that one died, and now this one's been alone ever since. And we talked about a little bit about communicating with the horse and how you had to kind of speak the horse's language so the horse understood. And I love this lady to death, but she's got one of those voices that's a little high pitched, and she talks really loud all the time. Kind of grates a little bit. And I'm sure that's part of the nervousness of that horse, is hearing her voice kind of, a little bit. Because they don't talk verbally. Horses don't talk verbally. It's all body language. So I'd work with him a little bit, and I'd show her, and I'd say, Don, that he just relaxed. His head went down, he started kind of smacking his lips, his eyes got softer, he's relaxed, he's doing this. And by the time I got done, I could raise my hands, and he'd walk around me in a circle, and I'd lower my hands, and he'd stop, turn around, come put his head on my chest. We had a good time. And she got a chance to see how her horse was communicating, so that in the future, she can do it. She can go out there herself and work with that horse. I said, now you need to do this on a regular basis. Horses, I don't know if any of you know, horses are either right or left-handed. Most horses are left-handed. You put the halter on the left side, you get on the left side, you do everything on the left side. As a horseshoer, you realize that quickly because the right hind foot is always the hardest one for them to pick up and behave. It's the farthest thing away from what they normally do. So I said, you got to spend a lot of time with him, and especially spend it on that right side. So he relaxes. She actually was in tears for a while watching him work. That communication, that little thing there, when I saw that, I thought, boy, that is an example of God's communication with us sometimes. Because he was wanting to pull back and fight all the time. That's how he acted, but that's not what he wanted. Because what he wanted was to be close. Because once we got through it, once we got past all the communication issues, he relaxed and he was comfortable. And he found out it was safer to be close than it was to be far. He found out it was better to be here, up close to me, because if he's up close, he's doing something right. Because if he does something wrong, one day he can go around again. So he learned that. I think God's like that a lot. And Jesus talks about this in that parable, about the different ways people listen or don't listen. So I want to talk about that communication with God here. Okay? There's 4 ways that Jesus talks about how people listen here. There's 4 listening styles that are mentioned in this parable. And we need to look at these things in 2 ways. Number 1, we need to recognize that they're there, and that all of us have this list. All of us have all 4 of these listening styles in some aspect of our life. Somewhere in our life, we all have these listening styles. But only one of them is suitable for God. And that's because that's the only one that will really build relationship. So the first one is that some people just don't listen at all. In Luke 8:5, it said, a farmer went out to sow his seed. As he scattered the seed, some fell along the path. It was trampled on, and the birds ate it up. Well, that's someone who's listening like a blacktop road, like a parking lot. You can throw seeds on a parking lot all you want. They're not coming up. Someone actively is saying no. They're actively not listening. That's a choice. That's a choice that someone takes. The heart is hardened. We're planting, the seeds of God are planted, and nobody wants to receive it. That's a hard heart. And there are times in our lives when we have that, hopefully not with God, but with other people. Someone will say something, I don't even want to hear your opinion. I know it's different than mine. I'm not going to listen to what you say. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, there's a story about him when he was president, and he's constantly talking, and he doesn't think anybody's listening. And he's in a receiving line one of those times where, the politicians are standing there and all these other people are coming in, and you shake every single hand as it comes along. And he was going to test it. So he said, they shake hands, he said, I murdered my grandmother this afternoon. And people say, oh, nice for you. And then they walk on. And he just went down the line saying that. I murdered my grandmother this afternoon. And he'd smile. And nobody heard it. Except one foreign guy that came through and was shaking his hand. He said, I murdered my grandmother this afternoon. The guy kind of stopped and looked at him. Then he leaned in and said, she probably deserved it. There are times when we go out of our way not to hear. And that's what Jesus is warning about here, is that actively not listening. Now, why don't people listen? There's three real ways, I think, three real reasons. And Jesus talks about this when he explains the parable. The first one is pride. I can do it myself. I don't need God. I don't need anybody to tell me what to do. I can just do it myself. That's an easy trap for us to fall into. The second one is bitterness. Something happens, you get hurt, and then you turn and say, why did God do this? Now that's not a biblical viewpoint, but it's something that's natural for us. When you get hurt, you have two choices. You can either be bitter or you can be better by it. Something happens that's painful. It can either make you better or it can make you bitter. That's a choice. You may not choose what happens to you, but you can choose how you react to it. Unfortunately, the bitterness is going to make us close ourselves off from God and oftentimes blame Him. And the third way that our hearts get hardened is just a complete lack of understanding. Not understanding that God really wants to talk to you. Yes, you. God wants you. We forget that sometimes. We don't understand that. But in Psalm 25:9, the psalmist writes that he guides the humble in what is right and teaches them his way. Humility, being humble, means that you're teachable. Have you ever thought about that? To be taught, you have to humble yourself enough to say, I need to learn what you have to say. You can't teach someone who doesn't think that the teacher knows anything or the teacher has anything beneficial to say. You have to be humble to learn. And that's what all these other things kind of add up to, is with the pride, with the bitterness, the lack of understanding, all of those things come from us, a lack of humility. And we need to be humble to understand these things. Now, the second listening style that's portrayed in this is that some people listen and then they forget. They listen, but they don't hold on to the information. Some fell on rocky ground, and when it came up, the plants withered because they had no moisture. If the first example was planting on a parking lot, this is for planting in gravel. If I planted a plant in gravel, I could water it and water it and water it, and it might sprout, but it won't last very long. Because that water is going to go through that gravel, and the roots will never reach the soil. And it's easy for us to fall into that trap too, where we hear it, surface-like, we nod, and then we let it go, and we never think about it again. It's easier to forget than it is to remember. When we talk about the Word here, we talk about the Word and listening and what we're supposed to be doing, we're not supposed to hear it once and walk away. We're supposed to meditate on it. We're supposed to consider it. We're supposed to think about it more than once. And we're supposed to put it into practice. James 1:22 says, do not merely listen to the Word and so deceive yourselves. Do what it says. And that's a trap that's very easy to fall into. That is, it's a trap that's very easy to fall into on a Sunday morning. You come and you hear the Word, you nod your head, yep, I understand that, but then you never think about it again. Sometimes that's a problem with the televangelists that are on TV or on the radio. You can be very entertained by listening to a good sermon on the radio. But that's as long as your attention span stays on it. And then you walk away from it. If you don't spend some time thinking about it and going back to it again, it's going to slip away. And if it slips away, then we're not putting it to use. To put it to use, we have to actually spend time thinking about it. The Air Force did a study, and they said that you lose 90 to 95% of what you hear within 72 hours. You're going to hear something, and within 72 hours, 90% of what you heard is gone. Now, if you've ever been to a faith-based rally or concert or something like that, you get that. Because you come out of there just top of the world. Everybody's praying, the Spirit's moving, everything's feeling really good, and it's way up here. Or you hear a speaker and you go, oh, that is so awesome. And a couple days later, somebody said, well, what was it? I heard you were going to that speaker. What was it like? Oh, it was awesome. What did they say? I don't know, but it was awesome. You got the emotion, but you didn't retain the information. And that's a hearing thing. But what they did find in that study is if someone writes it down, they'll retain it a lot longer. I know that myself. When I'm learning things, or it doesn't matter if I'm in a meeting or anything, if I write it down, it sticks more. I don't even have to look at what I wrote, just because I did the action of writing it down. This summer, we're going to work on Pete with cursive. He's going to be actively writing with his hands. And the reason we're doing that is not only for the motor skill that goes along, but also because that flow of cursive writing helps your brain flow. It's not chunky, it flows. And there's been a lot of studies done in school settings now, because in our school, cursive is not really taught. But the studies they're doing now say that that's extremely beneficial for the development of not only motor skills, but also the brain patterns and the way you process things. So it's kind of starting to make a comeback in educational circles as well. But basically what this study that the Air Force did came down to said that the shortest pencil is longer than the longest memory. Just a little bit of writing will get you a long way. I see that myself in my life. I'm not as good at it as others, particularly my wife. Every day she gets on Facebook and she posts a verse. Every day she puts one up. In her blogs, when she's writing on her blog page, she'll post verses there. And she has to stop and write them down. She's not reading it, she's not copying and pasting it like I do sometimes. She is actually writing it out. Makes a difference. It sticks with you better that way. If you can take a verse and write it down, it makes it part of who you are. That's why in the Old Testament, all the kings in the Old Testament, if you look, David and those areas, all of those men were meant to write out the law of Moses themselves. Not to have somebody else write it for them, but each of the kings were supposed to write down, copy down the law of Moses themselves. Why? Because they wouldn't forget it if they did it themselves. You could have somebody droning on in the background telling you those things all day long, and it won't mean nearly as much as if you take the time to write them yourself. There's meaning there, there's benefit there, because it will hold and the roots will sink deeper. If not only do we hear it, do we read it, but we write it, we contemplate it, we stop and we think about it. The third listening style mentioned in this one is that some people listen, but it's really not important to them. It's enough. It's important enough for them to sit still and listen, but it's not important enough to keep. Luke 8:7 says, other seed fell among thorns, which grew up with it and choked the plants. People receive it, but then they let everything else choke it out and take it away from them. Having it is one thing, and keeping it is completely different. And this is where this one comes in. It talks about the weeds and growing up within the weeds, and how the weeds choke it out. If you look at your life, what are your weeds? Jesus explained it again. Later on in Luke 8, when Jesus is going through this parable with his disciples, he talks about, again, three things. Things that distract you or preoccupy you. Things in your life. The first one he talked about is worries. Then he talked about money. And the third one he talked about was busyness. Not business, busyness. Now I look at those three things and I can see all three things have taken my attention, my mind in places throughout my life over and over again. I have laid asleep at night worrying about all these things. I've been so busy during the day that I go to bed tired, and then I can't sleep because I'm thinking about all the busyness I still got to do, that I'm behind, I have other things to do. When you're short on money or you're long on money, it doesn't matter. You're always thinking about those things too. The worrying about things gets in our mind, but God has an answer. Jesus had an answer. God has an answer for all of these words, all of these things. The first one, talking about worry, Matthew 6:34 says, "Therefore do not worry about tomorrow, for tomorrow will worry about itself. Each day has enough trouble on its own." There's a nice long passage, and there's a piece of it in the back about considering the plants, and this is the end of it. It's all in Matthew 6. When Jesus talks about worry, it's not worth it. All the worrying in the world will not change anything. So if you're letting your worries separate you from God, if you're letting your worries take away from your listening, it's a worthless pursuit. You're taking it in, but you're not keeping it. Okay? It's not important enough that you put it in front of your own worry. That's a concept that's a little hard for us. The second one he talked about was money. In 1 Timothy, Paul talks about it and says, "For the love of money is a root of all kinds of evil. Some people eager for money have wandered from the faith and pierced themselves with many griefs." Now, this is the quote from the Bible, okay? Not the one that you hear all the time. Money is not the root of all evil. It says money is the root of all kinds of evil. Okay? That one's one of the ones that's misquoted often. And money can be poverty, a lack of it. It can be an excess. It can be thinking about making more. It can be thinking about how you're going to spend it. All of those things could be the money that's getting in your mind and getting in the way. I remember as a kid, we didn't have anything. We were officially poor. There was an official standard. I'm sure we met it. But my mother raised us with having a pride in that poverty, which was wrong. I realized in my life later on that it wasn't a bad intention on her part, but it was bad on my part the way I took it. Because pride in poverty means but pride just means you're better than somebody else. So you're better if you're poor. It's kind of how we came out. And that was wrong. Mom had the best of intentions trying to make sure that we weren't embarrassed in poverty, but the pride in poverty went the wrong direction. But money is one of those things that just constantly causes issues. If you ask a couple, a married couple, especially in their early years, what their biggest arguments are over, always going to be the money. Who's spending what where? How are we going to cover this bill? How are we going to cover that bill? Seems like everything's kind of clicking along, and then all of a sudden the washer breaks down, and the car breaks down, and you got all these other issues, and bills come up, and all those things, and that can really hurt that relationship. The communication about money is hard. It's not something that you've never ever had to do and share with someone else before. And now all of a sudden, as a couple, you have to share that. You share the burden and you share the responsibility. And that's tough. It can also be something that comes between us and God. And the last one that he talked about was busyness. And our world is full of that. Mark 6:31, "Then because so many people were coming and going, they did not even have a chance to eat, he said to them, 'Come with me by yourselves to a quiet place and get some rest.'" Jesus did this himself, by himself, on several accounts in the gospel, where he just went away. He needed time with God, so he got away from what was causing the busyness. He separated himself off and got away from it. We need to do that too. He's giving us an example here. He tells the disciples, "Come with me by yourselves." God is telling us today when we look at this, come with me by yourselves. Now some people it's going to vary by you as an individual and what you do. I've come to the habit of spending my time with God in the morning. And that habit was cultivated by the person who lays next to me in bed getting up in the morning, because that's what she does and that's what I do now. And we don't do it together, we do it separately. We'll spend time praying together, but we will spend time separately in the Word, praying individually. And I saw this first with my wife when I first met her. Every morning when we were in Africa, we were over in Somalia, she would be up before anybody else reading her Bible. I saw that early on, and I realized that was a precious time to her. That was important. It was important enough to give up sleep to spend time with the Word. And I've gotten to that point in my own life where I feel that too. It's important enough for me to give up something because I receive so much more if I do. Now to do that, I have to let go of all the busyness and all the other things going on. I'm a music guy. I like to listen to music. If you come up and lift weights with us, you got to scream when you're talking because we got it so loud up there your ears are bleeding. I like that. When I drive in the car, I got something on. I like to have that noise. Even if I'm working outside, sometimes I like to listen to things. I can't do that when I'm talking to God. I can listen to a song and then stop it and then think about it because I might listen to a Christian song that really hits me hard and gets in my heart and I think about that. You know, Just a Closer Walk with Thee just came up today, and that's one of the ones I think about that in the garden. Thinking about the concept of walking in the Garden of Eden with God the same way that Adam walked in the Garden of Eden with God. Just a closer walk with you, walking in the garden. All of those things, yes, but if you let it go, if you keep the white noise going in the background, you will not hear God. You have to separate it out and give him your undivided attention. Hate to bring Jane up again, but one of the communication issues we had when we first got married was the fact that her job in the Army was that she was a reporter. And you will notice that sometimes if you watch closely, I'm trying to throw her in the bus here, when she meets a new person, she will ask lots of questions. She will interview that new person. And she has an excellent memory for everything she asks, so she'll know all sorts of things about somebody right away. They will not know anything about her, except the fact that she was interested enough that she asked questions. And people in general like to talk about themselves. They like to share who they are. So it's easy that everybody likes her. But she doesn't tell you anything about herself. She just asks questions. So when we first get married, I feel like she's constantly interviewing me. Because she won't tell me anything. She just asks me questions. And for the guys in the room, you know what a pitfall that is. There are traps all over there. They ask those questions and you know, oh, how should I answer? I don't know what I should say because she probably wants an answer, but I don't know what it is. Now, for my side of that communication thing, she was a reporter, I was an interrogator. I set traps for a living. So the two of us would just ask each other questions and nobody would answer. It was terrible communication. She was always afraid that I was trying to get her to admit to something, and I was always thinking, but she's just never going to tell me what she wants. It was hard for us at first. We got through it eventually. And she would actually say, stop interrogating me. And I would catch myself and go, that's exactly what I'm doing. Some of those money issues would come up, and I'd start, and she'd say, you're doing it again. I had to learn to quit that, to stop and listen to what she had to say. Maybe listen to her body language. Maybe listen to what she's saying with her eyes and not with her voice. But understanding that is important. It's important for us to get past these things, to leave them behind, to show what's really important in our lives. Now the fourth one that Jesus talks about, the fourth listening style that Jesus talks about is what I think we should be espousing to. And that is that some people listen and hear. Still other seed fell on good soil. It came up and yielded a crop 100 times more than was sown. That's why you plant, right? I know I got farmers in the room here. You don't plant one seed to get 2 seeds. You plant 1 seed to get 100 seeds from that seed, or it wouldn't be worth putting the first seed in the ground because you put too much effort into it. The goal is for a 100-fold harvest to come from those seeds. And if 3/4 of the seed was lost, but 1/4 of it still produced 100% of what 100-fold yield on what it was supposed to produce, you'd still be in the profit side. And that's what Jesus was saying here. The ones that make it are the ones that put it into good soil, that are listening, that are holding on to it, that are grasping this. So, what are we holding on to? Well, all these other things lead up to this. All the other things about don't do it this way, don't do it this way, don't do it this way, do it this way. Now, Elijah had this issue, listening to God, in 1 Kings. 1 Kings 19, God says, I'm going to talk to you, I'm going to present myself to you. Well, listen. It says, then a great and powerful wind tore the mountains apart and shattered the rocks before the Lord, but the Lord was not in the wind. After the wind there was an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. After the earthquake came a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire came a gentle whisper. That is the voice of God. God's not forcing you to do anything. There may be times when it feels like God's shouting in your life because he needs to get your attention. There's times when I feel like there's been a boom of thunder in my mind going, oh, that's what you meant. But God's way of communicating is not to yell at us. His way of communicating is that gentle whisper. Now, if you listen to the big-time preachers, the guys that are really, really good, you will see a pattern. I saw the same pattern. Jane bought a book for worship leaders once, and we saw the same pattern there. In the pattern that's laid out for successful worship music, the first one, we do it here, everybody stands up, and you sing something a little rowdy. You get people's undivided attention. And then the next one, you go just a little bit deeper, and then the next one, right before the sermon, you should go quiet and soft, because that brings your focus in. And if you listen to a really good speaker when he wants to make a very important point, or maybe the last point, the voice will be soft. And people will lean forward to hear. That's very active listening. It will encourage the active listening by that soft whisper. And God wants us to grow closer to him. And when you can't hear somebody, you get closer to him. And that's where that whisper comes from. He wants to draw us in. If we're doing it right, we should be listening for a whisper. And that's not a common thing today. That's not a popular thing today. In the world today, that's not something that is valued. But it needs to be valued in a Christian life. In the world today, white noise, all this stuff, all the chaos going around is important. I see it at the high school all the time. The minute they're out of class, they pop earbuds in. And they're walking down the hall and they're clicking on their phones and they got this stuff blasting in their ears. Completely shut out the world. It really shocked me this year because they're not supposed to have those things out in the classroom. But for that 3 minutes in the hallway, you can't get it away from them. They'd fight you over those earbuds. It shocked me this year because I had 7th graders. And I had one 7th grader whose mother's a teacher in 6th grade come in the first day with a great big set of red headphones on. And I know they didn't do anything like that in the elementary school. Why did he walk in the first day thinking that's what he needed to do? Well, he'd seen the other kids doing it. That was what was common. That's what's popular. Well, when we look at the world saying that, we need to remember that we need to hear that whisper. And we need to actively do whatever we can to shut out the rest of it and get away from it. There was a recent event happened. There's a woman named Joy Behar. She's on a talk show. I've never really seen it. I've seen clips of it. But she was making fun of the vice president. Because the vice president said, I listen to God before I speak. If I need to make a decision, I ask him and he tells me. And she cracked this joke, and she considers herself a comedian. So she cracked this joke about, well, by definition, hearing voices that aren't there, isn't that like mental illness? She said, it's so scary that our vice president's got this mental illness. She would later on apologize for it when Christians said, wait a minute, you don't understand what he's saying. But that concept, and she got applause for it. That concept of stopping and listening to what God says before you make a decision, before we do anything else in our lives, to stop and consider. That's not of the world, that's of God. And we need to focus on that. I had a really sweet experience. Jane told the story about the goose. And by the way, when I'm doing my PowerPoint this morning, when we wake up, the goose wakes up, and the goose makes noise. He's in a box. He makes noise. So I picked him up and I held him when I was reading the Bible and stuff. And he just fell asleep in my arms. Then I got to do the PowerPoint, I got to type. I had my bathrobe on, I got a big pocket. I don't know if anybody else has ever done this before, but working on a sermon with a goose in your pocket, this was my first time. I had a live goose in my pocket. But the other day, the De La Rosa kids were all over, and it was the day after the goose showed up. And of course, they can't keep their hands off of it. Everybody wants to play with the goose and stuff. That first day, he wasn't eating. He hadn't eaten anything. Jane called me. I'm off horseshoeing somewhere when she finds this goose. And she calls me and tells me to stop at LTM and pick up grits. She figured that's as close to chicken feed she can think of. She's trying oatmeal, and she said, pick up some grits. So I got grits, and I brought hominy. I thought, well, maybe some softer stuff. We got a whole bunch of stuff that we won't eat normally sitting in the house now, because the goose won't really mess with it either. We find out later on they eat grass, and we got a lot of that.
And he eats cheese.
You shouldn't give him cheese. I don't think that's good for a goose. Anyway, the De La Rosa kids are all over there, and he's sitting in my hand, and I'm trying to feed him something. And Gabby comes up, and in the perfect example of that childlike faith we talked about last week, Gabby comes up and starts stroking his head and said, God really wants you to eat. You need to eat. God thinks gooses should always eat. I thought that was the sweetest thing. She comes up and starts telling the goose what God wants. That's the example of that childlike faith, but it's also an example of listening. She's heard that somewhere and she remembered. If things are going the way it is, that's the way God wants it. She remembered that. So for us, when we look at these things, I want us to think about where we are in our relationship with God. We all have these 4 listening styles. We all use them at different times. But God needs to get the benefit and the focus of all of our attention. If we want to hear from Him, we got to listen to Him. We need to be reading His Word. We need to be thinking about that. We need to be spending time in prayer. And our prayer time, here's a challenge for you. In your prayer time, spend as much time silent as you do talking. Because in prayer, don't we ask? But how many times do we stop and listen for the answer? Spend some time in silence, just listening.
Amen.
Just hearing what God has to say. Because He'll talk to you if you give Him a chance to get a word in edgewise, which we don't normally. If you are a listener, if you're active listening to God, then you're fulfilling the role that we're meant to fulfill. John, chapter 10, verse 27. Jesus says, my sheep listen to my voice. I know them, and they follow me. He spoke a lot about the sheep and the shepherd, but this one I think is very special. He talks about how somebody climbs over the fence. That's not a shepherd. That's a thief. If you have a hired man with the sheep and the wolf comes, the hired man really doesn't care. He's going to run off. He's going to protect himself first because it's not his sheep in the end. But the true shepherd who truly cares, the sheep know that. And the image that you have is that image of, in the Aramaic world, they would bring the sheep in every night, and they had pens, lots of pens. And they would open up, there'd be a gatekeeper that would open the key, or open the gate up, and the sheep would all go in. And the next morning, when it was time to take them out, the shepherd would go out, the gate people would open all the gates, and the shepherds would call the sheep. And their sheep would separate themselves from the other sheep and follow them. And Jesus says, my sheep know my voice. They'll follow me. Do you know His voice? Right now, do you know His voice? God is speaking whether you're listening or not. But we should be listening. We need to close out whatever that white light is blinding us to His truth, to His Word. He speaks through His written Word. You read through the Gospels, you read through the Old Testament, you read through the letters, you will find God there. He speaks in prayer. He speaks in ways around us that we will see physically. If we stop to look, we'll see, hey, that was God. We'll see something and go, hey, God just said something really loud there. We were really blessed in this church to experience Shannon, in his accent. And that was God speaking.